Hello, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the next installment in my Sicilian Dragon Masterclass series. We've already taken a look at the Yugoslav attack. Now today, we are going to be exploring the Levenfish variation. The Levenfish variation occurs after e4, c5, knight f3, now the open Sicilian, d6, d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, and now f4. If you're thinking, whoa, we've gone way too quickly, I don't understand how we've gotten here. Go take a look at my introductory video in this series and all will become very clear. Now the reason White has committed to f4 so early is that they are looking to get a very quick e5 in, threatening our knight on f6 and contesting our control of the central e5 square. This is a quasi-Grand Prix attack. If you're unfamiliar with the Grand Prix attack, it is a variation in the closed Sicilian lines, but the Levenfish appears to have much more sting than it really does. The reason I enjoy playing it as White against Dragon players, though, is that Black does tend to be a little bit underprepared for these lines. Perhaps I will have to stop playing it though after this video of course goes viral and everyone is familiar with all of the key lines. Or at least the idea is that you will be very familiar with it and able to neutralize it very easily. There are 3 key ways that Black can continue here, all of which are very good. Knight c6 tends to be the most popular at master level. It's very solid indeed. Knight b to d7 is the line I would recommend if you want to cut down on the amount of theory you have to learn. The idea is very simple. It is very solid, and we will look at it in due course. The most natural move for Black to play, however, is bishop to g7, and this is where White can get a very quick edge if Black doesn't know what they're doing. However, where Black is prepared, according to the Lichess database, they possess incredible winning chances. So it might be, if you're feeling courageous, the line for you. We will address each in turn. Let's start right here with bishop to g7. So I said earlier, of course, that the idea behind f4 is to push e5 immediately, threatening our knight here in the center. What if they don't, though? What if they get their preparation wrong and they push f5 instead? Nothing to worry about. Develop the knight to c6. If they take the pawn, we take back with our h-pawn, and now we have a near 2-point advantage. Everything will fizzle out for White here. They'll just have an overextended, isolated pawn in the center, and we'll be absolutely fine. If instead of capturing on g6, they decide to take our knight, well, now we just capture back on g6, and if ever they decide to push the e-pawn, that is simply a free pawn. We take that, and yes, we might be losing castling rights, but we are now in a queenless middle game with a pair of knights already removed from the board. We are up a pawn. We are just fine here. I think we have a 1.5 point advantage. Therefore, let's address e5. Okay, the main move, and the move to remember here, is knight to h5. That looks very awkward. It looks like we might be getting our knight trapped after g4, but first let's have a look at why we want to play knight to h5. Why not some other very natural looking moves? Okay, so we could capture in the center here, but the problem is that after our opponent captures back and we rotate this knight back to d7, of course we don't want to leave the knight there on pre, they can now push e6, and this is a little bit uncomfortable. The correct way to play here, which is quite unnatural, is to play knight back into the center with e5. If you remember this, you will be fine. If they take this pawn, you can actually take back with the knight or the king, but I would recommend taking back with the king so that you are a little bit closer to hand castling with a rook f8, and then we would tuck our king back into g8, where it would be nice and snug and protected. As I say though, you can capture with the knight and still be fine. Now you haven't moved the king, so you could castle in one go. However, if we decide to capture the pawn on e6 with our f-pawn, this is pretty bad for us because now they can capture back with the knight on e6. Notice that they are forking the queen and the bishop. So what we will have to do is play bishop takes on c3 as an intermezzo, and now something like queen a5. But this can very quickly get very uncomfortable. We can't take the bishop here because of this knight fork. So, you know, something like queen takes on c3, but this position just, it's it's too strong for white. Our knight is awkward and pinned. This knight is a nuisance. If we trade queens here, this position is just very difficult and very cramped for black to play. The engine is giving this, and despite black being a pawn up, a plus 3.1 advantage to white. It is objectively unsound. Your king isn't very safe. You're cramped. There are knight forking ideas in the air. They're going to be able to bring their rook into the game and start targeting your rook and harassing all of your pieces. Just don't go down this line. It is not worth it. So what should we remember in this line if we decide to take the pawn in the center, which is not my recommendation? When they recapture, we want to rotate the knight back and don't take with the pawn. Put the knight back in the center and you should be okay, even if bishop to b5 check. But now we have to move the knight to c6, and if they capture here again, we can capture with the king, and this is fine, but it again just seems to play itself for white and is a little bit too tricky and awkward for black. It's definitely not something that I would recommend, but I want to show you this line and make you familiar with it nevertheless, because it's important to understand the reasons behind the moves that we're playing. We don't just want to play them because we've memorized them. We need to understand how they are superior to alternative ideas, which ultimately helps us to remember the correct ideas. So what else do we have here? Well, we could rotate the knight back immediately. However, this is a mistake, again, because of this move, pawn to e6. Now, if we rotate the knight back to f6, they have this annoying bishop b5 check. How do you stop this easily? The pawn is clamping down on d7, preventing us from interposing with the bishop. Of course, if we interpose with the knight, we are just dropping material here. This is not pretty. This is very cramped. Do not find yourself going down this line. Okay, so they push e6 and you decide, to take here instead. Well, now you just have more of the same problems that we saw earlier. This is nearly +2 for white. Don't do it. So if you play bishop g7 and they play e5, you must remember knight to h5. And it is in these positions, according to the Lichess database, that black actually wins the majority of games, perhaps surprising white with their preparation. So what can white play here that looks tricky? Well, there is this move g4, which on the surface appears to just lose a knight, but it's actually a mistake because they drop this f4 pawn, and if they recapture with the bishop, well, now we can capture on e5, and because the e5 pawn is protected by our bishop, we simply have a fork here, and even after something like bishop to b5 check as an intermezzo, we just interpose with the bishop on d7, and we have a really fine position. This is just one sample continuation. Okay, so g4 covered, no problem. What else could they play? I suppose they could play f5, but this is just nonsense. We capture the pawn on e5, and after the bishop checks, again, we're interposing with the bishop on d7, and now we're just a pawn up, and their f5 pawn looks absolutely atrocious. So if they play e takes on d6, we arrive at an interesting moment. You can take the pawn on d6, and if they play something like knight b5, you can trade queens here. Careful about this fork. Remember to play knight to h6 to look after it, and you should be okay. Do not make the mistake of thinking, let's say if their knight goes to b3, that you can capture this pawn with your knight. That would be a horrific blunder, because now you would be dropping the queen. Yes, you're recapturing their queen, but this queen was the defender of your knight. You have now dropped a piece. So be careful about that. That's why when the knight moves out the way, be it to b5 or b3, we must grab the queen first. I mean, if the knight comes to b5, the queen's just being hit anyway, so of course you would never go for this, but just keep that tactic in mind and don't fall for it. But the move I'm actually recommending is not to immediately recapture. It's to castle, because I like moves that invite easy mistakes from my opponent. I like kind of setting traps, and here d takes on e7 looks like a fairly natural move to play. It looks fairly easy to contend with, but it is far, far, far too greedy. We can just take here with the queen, and now the king is checked in the center of the board, and observe the relative positions of our kings here. We are nicely tucked away. Yeah, okay, fine, we haven't got great development, but our king is really, really, really safe, and we will see now that there is not an easy way to deflect this check. let's say they try and deflect it with queen e2. You know, they're a pawn up. They're saying, okay, great. Let's try and get the queens off the board now and maintain my 1 pawn advantage. Well, now queen check on h4. How are you going to defend this? g3? No, now we take that pawn. You can't capture back. You're going to drop your rook. This is extraordinarily dangerous play for white. So, okay, king to d2. Well, now you just drop the knight, right? If king to d1, you just drop the knight. So this is very, very sharp. Okay, so they interpose with the bishop instead. Well, that bishop is pinned, so there's no threat of it taking our knight on h5 for the time being. So let's just go after this knight that's being attacked once by our bishop on g7, now being attacked a second time. There's a lot of pressure mounting up here. So you move your other knight to b5 to defend this, but this is very easily removed with the move a6. I mean, this is crushing, but even worse is again queen h4 check. Now, how do you defend? If king f1, we're coming in here with a check and the pawn is now pinned to the rook, and now we take the knight in the center of the board, because if you decide to play knight takes on d4, well, now we're going to take this piece and the king is checked and can't escape, so the queen must take. And of course, the reason behind this sequence of moves is now revealed with knight takes on e2, forking the king and queen. This is just game over. This is a very, very, very dangerous line for white. They have a number of other moves they could play, of course g3, but then we fall into this tactic again. So in this position, if you reach it and they take your d6 pawn, castle, and allow them to make that mistake of taking your pawn. If they don't, if they just play a developing move, well, now queen d6, and we've got the pawn that we came for, and everything is fine, right? Okay, so there is one more move we must cover in the bishop g7 lines in order to call ourselves adequately prepared, and it is bishop to b5 check. Now we must block with the bishop on d7. If g4 now, by the way, this idea is still lurking in the periphery. We still have this fork, so this is great for us. But if not, if they push e6, which is the kind of central idea behind these kinds of moves, then f takes on e6, and after knight takes on e6, we can remove this knight and play queen a5. Now, this is subtly different from the positions that we were playing earlier that I told you to avoid. I think white's best continuation here is to snatch this bishop, and rather than taking with the knight, I would actually take back with the king, putting the king in this shelter in the center of the board and kicking their knight back to g5. Now we can kick their knight again or develop our knight to c6 and have a nice... Okay, it's a little bit tricky of a game here with our king positioned in the center like this, but I don't know, it's kind of not incongruous with my playstyle to be attracted to this kind of thing. It does appeal to my native sensibilities, if you like. But yeah, those are the main ideas to be aware of after bishop to g7. When we see e5, play knight h5. Don't be afraid of f5. It's dumb and silly. Don't be afraid of g4. It is not a trap. We just take the pawn on f4 and get our fork. If bishop to b5 check, interpose with the bishop and you should be fine. And then the other line was, yes, e takes on d6. Bait them with the castles. If they develop, take the pawn. And if not, open up a can of whoop-ass by checking their king and harassing them with queen h4 check ideas with a beautifully placed knight now, notice, on h5. This knight on the rim, potentially dim, is now one of the best pieces on the board, allowing us to pull off these crazy tactics. Enjoy! Okay, so knight c6 is a very solid move to play. White now has two main ways to continue. They can develop another piece, or they can grab our knight on c6. But if they spend time developing a piece, let's say bishop to e3, this just seems a little bit slow since you played f4 wanting to push e5. Shouldn't you be making these breaks in the center already? I don't know. I mean, otherwise it just looks like a bit of a silly move. So knight takes on c6. B takes on c6, and now e5. This was the idea that brought you here in the first place, was it not? Now we can drop the knight back to d7, and if e6 here, well, now we just grab the pawn, and this strong center is not going anywhere. There's simply nothing to be afraid of. I mean, I've now included the engine's best continuation. This is if white plays every single best move consecutively, and even then, it still seems pretty good for us. There's this little trick. I mean, if you're coming up against a purebred stockfish head, you're going to want to remember, give this pawn back, play knight to c5, allowing our bishop to protect this pawn, luring the queen to take this pawn, and when this check occurs, tuck the king into d7, and you are just enjoying a 2.4 advantage here. You have this central fortress and a strong attack brewing. Okay, so let's say they take on d6. Well, now we capture back, and if queen d4, going after our rook, on h8 in the corner here, we can now interpose this either with our knight or with our queen. It doesn't really matter so much which, it's a matter of personal preference, I suppose. If you enjoy grinding it out in the endgame, you are going to want to play queen f6, offering a trade of queens, getting the queens off the board, or you can play knight f6. So if queen f6 and we do get the queens off the board, then you're just going to play something like bishop to e7 and bishop to e6, and you don't even need to castle here. There are some lines where you can play king to d7 and still be perfectly safe, but you can go after that dark squared bishop immediately with knight to g4 and castle if you like. This is completely equal, and if they kick your knight, you can actually just go after their bishop, and after this trade occurs, you will be picking the pawn back up on g4, and again, this is completely equal, except black does enjoy the bishop pair. So, okay, let's say you decide to play knight f6 instead. Now they play something like bishop to e3. You want to play bishop to e7 again. The reason we're playing bishop to e7 in these lines and not bishop to g7 is that these central pawns want to be well looked after. They could be a little bit of a tender spot, and you don't want to allow white to massage your position open by going for these weaknesses. We want to keep them nice and heavily defended so that we can use them to our advantage, such as in the subsequent line. Castles, if something like bishop e2, let's just throw these pawns up the board and use them to bully our opponent's pieces. Now we get this fork, but if, queen e1, we need to be very careful here. We can't obviously accept one of the pieces just yet because we would be hanging our queen, but I mean, this is just completely winning for us. The knight goes, and we have a strong attack brewing on our opponent's queen side. This looks really, really nice. Personally, I would not be giving up the queen on f6. I would be putting the knight in on the f6 square. And if you are this prepared, I mean, just scanning the Lichess database in the Masters database at the minute, I mean, black is winning the overwhelming majority of games. I don't think there are any white games won. It is draws all the way down the line and black winning, and in the player database it is it is pretty much in black's favor all the way down, so you could feel very confident implementing this into your repertoire. Okay, Andrew, there's way too much theory. I can't be bothered to learn all of this. All right then, well, knight b2 d7. What is there to remember? Almost absolutely nothing. I mean, okay, they play bishop to b5, pinning your knight. Well, we just kick this piece, and if they trade down here and play e5, then we can now play this intermezzo where we attack the queen and we just chop the pieces off here, and we're going to trade down on d5 and just be absolutely solid. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. So if instead of doing that, if they don't play for the pin and they just play something like bishop to e2, developing a little bit more timidly, we just play bishop to g7 and bishop e3, castles, this is fine. We're actually just going to have ideas of pushing e5 here. Yes, this backwards pawn might be a bit of a nuisance in the long term, but I would happily accept a backwards pawn to be able to have this lovely, lovely, lovely outpost on e5 for my pieces. I mean, let's have a look at one sample continuation. a6 seems like a very natural move to me, preventing all of this nonsense, and this is the engine's best response. I mean, now we push e5. If f takes on e5, we take back with the knight, and we just have a very, very, very strong game from this position. And if something like knight to b3 instead, well, now we can chop the piece off and still play in here with the knight. And if they trade down and we get the queens off the board, this is, again, perfectly playable. It's a little bit of a nuisance that we've had to block the scope of this bishop, but it can come out into the game in various other ways, and perhaps we will play for a f5 break, and then this pawn will become free and our bishop's scope will open up again. So you will notice that actually there is not much to remember in the knight b to d7 lines at all. So if you're a little bit bogged down in theory, perhaps your other lines are incredibly dense in your other openings, and you don't want to have to remember too much because the Levenfish variation is a side line already. Just remember knight b to d7. But if you want my recommendation, perhaps I said at the start of this video that I wasn't recommending bishop to g7, but you know, I think if I had this position, even in a classical game over the board, I think I would be playing bishop to g7 here. I don't think I would be able to resist tempting my opponent into e5 and playing knight h5. Because I know, just from a psychological perspective as well, that they would probably think they had a sure edge here, and I would love to see them fall into a line like this. I mean, wouldn't that just be beautiful? I mean, you can't really go wrong unless you end up in those very complicated lines where white pushes e6 and looks to take advantage of the pressure that they apply on d7. But if you want a safer bet that is very solid, of course you have knight c6. A little bit more theory to learn there, but knight b to d7 will serve you just fine as well. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it's been incredibly useful. Look out for the next installment in the series that will be addressing the fianchetto variation of the dragon. Please like, comment, and subscribe. That really, really, really does help me out. It helps the algo bosses point people in my direction, which is lovely. Take care, and as always, I will see you in the next one.